Good evening. It's my great pleasure to welcome Charles Jencks to the AA. Of course, Charles is no stranger. He has taught here for many years. He's currently a vital member of our campaign board and has been an incredible supporter of the AA. Today sees the publication of the second revised and updated edition of Charles's The Architecture of the Jumping Universe, How Complexity Science is Changing Architecture and Culture, which was published by Academy Editions, and it's now available again, as I said, through its second edition. I think, as Charles has said, or at least I think has implicitly probably mentioned in the introduction to this book himself, it's a book that I think is meant to change architecture rather than interpreting it. I think Charles has always been ahead of so many other people to really interpret, bring together, introduce certain notions that have been very much part and parcel of the culture of architecture. But I think with this particular book, The Architecture of the Jumping Universe, he really begins to open up the discussion towards what is the future possibilities, what are the future directions for architecture. And I think he's really constructing a very different project, a much more collaborative project involving issues of new sciences of complexity, revising certain aspects of cosmogenesis, and all of these issues that somehow have for a while been really on the fringes of architectural discussions, now beginning to see what new possibilities they have in terms of our rethinking, for example, of architecture and landscape's relationship to issues of nature, aspects of ecology, so on and so forth. And I think this is an incredibly provocative project, and I think Charles will be showing us, hinting at some of the new possibilities and new directions. Apart from teaching at the AA, of course, Charles has also taught at a number of other institutions for many years. He was a visiting professor at UC Los Angeles. He's also, of course, has published many books, including The Language of Postmodern Architecture, Architecture Today, What is Postmodernism, Late Modern Architecture, Postmodern Classicism, and so on. Would you please join me in welcoming Charles Jencks?
Started off by coming unplugged, so I'll plug myself in again. Well, I'm going to be talking today about, with this title of Redesigning the Universe, the idea that architects can reclaim a discourse today in a period when religion and science, having been in a battle of 300 years, have more or less rendered each other into corners that, of which they cannot retreat. And this, although very disturbing in many respects, forms an opening for people with a different culture and different background. So although I will be starting in a somewhat negative frame, discussing the 5 falls of culture, the fall being a metaphor taken from a Judeo-Christian culture. We come after the fall, after 5 falls, and that presents a terrific opportunity. Behind what I'm going to be saying is some philosophy which I won't get into, but let me just say that it's based on 2 theories. One is the theory of Jerome Bruner, who's a psychologist from Harvard and other places. And he has written, among his many books, he wrote Acts of Meaning in 1990, in which he argues that identity, our sense of self and personality, is very much connected to narrative, to the stories we tell ourselves is a form of self-construction. We have dispersed selves in many senses, but insofar as our identity as a whole, one of the most strong way it's formed is through story or narrative. And one of his students, he's a man of 82 now, is a woman who wrote a wonderful book called Narratives Inside the Crib. And it turns out that this self-construction starts at the age of about 8 months when you start babbling to yourself. And the first narratives you start to tell yourself are based on crises and an ability to structure your language in such a way that the difference between sometimes and always is worked out. In other words, what things always reoccur, like your mother coming back, you hope, and things that sometimes reoccur, such as your daddy sometimes coming back, but not always. And many other minor crises like that are taken by these 1-year-olds or less and narrativized. And this narrative is very important in forming identity. Now, the other point, basic theory, is that of Jean-François Lyotard, who says in the postmodern world, postmodern condition, we are in a certain crisis because all meta-narratives have been thrown into doubt or skepticism or become incredible or non-credible. And this must have an influence on our micro-narratives. In other words, there is a relationship between micro, the daily narrative you tell yourself, the way you orient yourself, and the way the culture does as a whole, and the way we orient ourselves to the largest thing, which is the universe. So I will be arguing that today, and maybe for the last 10 or 15 years, we have a new narrative, and it is the story of the universe story, as the title of one of the books of 1992 is. And that universe story really is changing not only the narratives of the individual, but the narratives of religion and science themselves. So that's the kind of big picture. Now, could we have the lights off? And I will race through a series of metaphors, some of them intended, some of them unintended, reminding you that architecture always has had a cosmological basis in Hindu architecture, in Chinese architecture, in the architecture at Lascaux, in that is to say, my position is somewhat traditional, or very traditional, in the sense that the daily passage of the sun formed one of the bases for the pyramid as a sign of the passage of the sun from east to west and the passage of the life of the pharaoh. And the architecture was cosmically oriented in both in a micro sense, in the sense that the flooding of the Nile every year left behind, after the spring tides diminished somewhat, the floods diminished little piles of black mud, which then became, out of which came the papyrus and lotus. And that formed the two signs and ornamental signs of Upper and Lower Egypt. So in all sorts of ways, Egyptian architecture was cosmically oriented for more than 3,000 years. And of course, in Christianity, one needn't point this out too much, but one still should minimally say that the Genesis story, the story that was told in the Old Testament and then the New Testament, are resolved in such things as Chartres Cathedral, in the sculpture, the stained glass, and the architecture itself. So the famous West Porch here from Chartres is, in which, by the way, the architects took didn't take the fees and lowered their fees for the architecture in order to allow this new form of sculpture to be created, these columnar people. This was an innovation at the time. This story culminates in a story about animals who are signs of the four evangelists, and of course figure of Christ as both in benediction and as a judge. So the Christian story, which lasts more or less up until the 16th century as a centering for the West, is a story of being at home in the universe, as the title of one of the books by Stuart Kauffman, a leader in complexity theory. The title of one of his books. Well, in a Christian worldview, it was very much, on the one hand, an anthropomorphic worldview. It located us in nature, in the cosmos, and in the universe, and in society. And I'll be telling things from the Western point of view because we are here in the West, and however much this narrative may have become, meta-narrative may have become incredible to us, it still, in all sorts of ways that are probably unconscious, remains as a locating narrative and metaphor in a legal sense. For instance, your sense as a person, and every time you swear that you will tell the whole truth and nothing but the truth, you are, in a sense, saying that your soul has some identity, and you can be judged, and you can have certain freedoms because you have this Christian background. In any case, looking at the metaphor that is unconscious in the Old Testament, in the six-day creation. This is from the Coverdale Bible of 1530. A visualization of the Genesis story. You can see in the first day of work, God is creating the heavens and the earth and separating day and night on the second day, and creating nature and then creating animals. What's interesting about this partly is that it's described in English as work. In other words, God is working. And it's, being a Protestant country, of course, there's no seventh day. In other words, there's only 6 days of work, and you don't even get the seventh day off here. That's a strange kind of Calvinist, Puritan, hard-working Protestant ethic, work ethic. And it tells us, in fact, in Genesis, man after man falls, mankind falls in original sin. One of the things after the fall he has to do is work forever and ever. So God's working and man is working. When man falls, he's punished by work. God is working. And what is God doing when he works? He's making things. And this becomes the deep metaphor that the universe is made, is crafted. It's a metaphor which Christians partly get from Plato, who said that God was the architect of all things, the maker of all things. And it's interesting if you look at this other visualizations of this, you see the two sides of Christianity, the Platonic side here with the perfect circle, in other words, the circles of the planets, and inside the earth is a Pythagorean story. It's a story of absolute harmony and geometry, God creating that perfect earth. And then on the right side, the Judeo part, after the fall, after eating of the apple of knowledge, an angel is expelling mankind from the Garden of Eden. So there is the first fall. And it's this tension between an absolute cosmic story of beauty and harmony on the one hand, the Pythagorean Platonic story, and a narrativized story in which we have a history, that is, we have a past, a beginning, a middle, and then finally a last judgment that distinguishes the Christian story from most of the other major religions. In other words, the other major religions are not historical. They don't have this Genesis story, this linear sequential timeline. And it is said that because of that timeline story, that the Jews and then the Christians projected themselves into history and could see themselves as having a historical destiny. And this gave them terrific confidence, gave them meaning, gave them interpretation of their place. And out of that comes modern science, because God was assumed to be a rational lawgiver. And here on the left, in a 13th century Bible, you see him, a moralized Bible, you see him laying out earth, air, water, and fire, the four elements, as an architect, as a male architect, making things again. So this recalls directly Plato's notion that God is the great architect of all things. And so you begin to see that this metaphor of making sets up a dialectic between a male architect on the one side and a universe on the other side. It's of course a metaphor that architects have always loved because it gives them a prime place and a prime justification. That's why in contemporary modern architecture in the 60s, it wasn't a surprise when Corbusier started projecting this image, not as God, but as a universal architect, and a notion that was taken up by Bucky Fuller. So, God as an architect as God, and God as a maker becomes a implicit understanding in the West. If we were in, say, a Buddhist culture, we wouldn't see things from this perspective. But this is our narrative. And immediately, and inherent in it, is the notion that therefore the universe is alienated or exiled from God, because God is not part of the universe. He creates this thing and then sort of lets it go and intervenes from time to time, or looks over it, or is imminently involved with it, but is somehow always distant from it, as indeed one is from a product. So one asks oneself, what is the implication of making? And if you get into this from a Freudian perspective, it was Freud who said that the second great fall was, of course, Copernicus, when we were suddenly not only alienated and exiled from God, but we found out that we were exiled from the center of the universe. And so you see two drawings which damaged our ego here, where the Earth is put out there in rotating around the sun. That's a diagram of Copernicus. And on the outer sphere, number one sphere, are the eternal unmoving background of stars. And then these other 9 or 8 spheres are rotating. Again, a picture, however, of perfect harmony. So the Platonism remains while the second fall occurs. Here's a British version of the same thing. And here you see the stars represented outside here, a perfect description of the celestial orbs, 1576, with the Earth in that 4th place. And you can read John Donne and lots of 17th century poets and others who are responding to how all fixities and definites have gone once we are displaced and set adrift, as it were, in the cosmos. And then, as if that weren't enough, there was the third fall, in which it was shown that not only were we rotating, we weren't the center of the universe, but we were the laws of the universe were based on mechanism, and this was an idea that really was put forward. This mechanism doesn't seem to work. It was put forward most clearly by Newton, but by a series of other scientists, Descartes, Galileo, also had mechanical descriptions. And this is a teaching instrument of the 18th century, which people who at school were taught to use to understand planetary rotation. And you can just see up in that corner a crank. And you take that crank and it cranks the planets in their perfect orbs around the sun, the 2 inner planets, and then the Earth up here with its moon going around. And so the laws that Newton unearthed about celestial motion and planetary motion could predict things almost completely accurately. And so the metaphor, the deep metaphor, became that the universe is a great clock, or a great machine, or a great orrery, as this teaching instrument is. And in some way that we don't understand, the whole universe is a machine, in fact, and man is a machine, as an 18th century book title had it, that the heart is a mechanical pump, and the brain is some kind of a very complex mechanical instrument. Of course, that idea was anathema to the Romantics and resisted by the Romantics, but such as William Blake, who you see in this watercolor of Newton, a watercolor, by the way, that Palozzi has now cast for the British Library, will be unveiled whenever the British Library, or if it's ever finished. It shows Newton in the nude here underwater with his, as the architect of the universe, laying out the pure geometric forms. And it's a satire of Newton. It's not a defense of Newton. And these funny things flowing in the sort of squids and octopus and underwater plants are suggesting a different kind of universe. But basically, Newton is laying out a mechanical one. And according to later evidence, Newton hated his body. So to portray him as a Michelangelesque strong man is another implicit satire. Anyway, Blake and the Romantics were marginalized as the mechanical worldview pervaded the 18th century and led to Adam Smith's mechanical notion of the economy, and that led to the mechanical environment, that is to say, the economic environment where mass-produced housing at minimal cost pervaded building from the 19th century right up to the present. The next fall, again, Freud talks about this, which was even more damaging in a sense than to find out that you were a machine, was to find out that you were descended from the apes and other animals. And so in 1859, with The Origin of the Species, the worldview, the harmonious worldview, the Christian worldview, the organic worldview, the Aristotelian worldview, which is painted by this 17th century painting. Again, I can't focus this thing, but you can see, there it is. You can see Adam here and Eve in a paradise garden being created by God in the upper corner there. And it's an idyllic ecological garden, a real paradise garden with all the animals laying down, the lion and the lamb laying down, a peaceful scene, an idyllic scene. They're all smiling. Everything is working perfectly. It's a benign nature. And, of course, it's a Christian narrative. But what is interesting, philosophically, and even in terms of the painting, is, if you look very closely, is the fact, I can point this thing, it had another few seconds of battery, I can't, is that Adam has a belly button. And if you think about it, this is a great theological catastrophe, right? Maybe this one I can point. How do I point this? Right, okay. Think about it. I mean, in a miraculous creation, of course, he's created ex nihilo, and there would have been no mother. So does the artist paint Adam with a belly button or not? Well, if Adam is painted without a belly button, it looks strange, doesn't it? Because we all know we have a belly button. But if he has a belly button, then he must have had a father and mother. So anyway, you know, by the time Darwin comes along, this crisis is really known about, but not faced. And anyway, you see in the iconography of Darwinism that throughout the 19th and into the 20th century, the evolution is represented as an increasing set of branches and trees, as if the whole universe is growing forward, and all the plants and animals and species are growing. So the notion of an evolutionary tree becomes the deep metaphor for everything after Darwin. And it's considered slightly positive. So there's a way in which Christians try to put the two narratives and metaphors together, and they come out with such mixtures as this timeline of about 1880, which shows Adam and Eve still with their belly buttons. If you look closely. Gosh, I'm having trouble with... What? Does it work?
Yes.
Okay. And Cain and Abel and the tribes, the 12 tribes, that is Old Testament history of Genesis, being tied up with the evolution of all the cultures, and then the evolution of the ancient histories that were known by 1870. So that is to say, the evolutionary trees of Darwin and the Christian story were combined, and you can imagine what this timeline ends with. It ends in 1870 with the two great culminations of Adam and Eve, that is to say, an English gentleman and an American gentleman. Western history, triumphant, an evolutionary story which became the story of manifest destiny. Well, so then if Darwin, as some wit said, supplied the family tree from which we could swing like an ape, you could take it, if you ended up on top, it looked pretty good, until people really started to look deeply at that, and then found out that that Darwinism is fundamentally based on the destruction of species. In other words, it is a war of nature, as Darwin said. And as, for instance, Stephen Jay Gould has recently said, it implies that decimation. It implies in this war that the only way things can move is if everything but few things are killed off. So instead of it being a bushy tree, it's a tree with only very few bushes getting through, but very few lines getting through, and blood everywhere else. In other words, it's a terrible story that alienates us from the universe. So that's another kind of fall and metaphor which pervades contemporary culture even. Here's the apostolic succession from the Copernican revolution, the Galilean mechanism, to Newton, to Laplace's determinism, through Smithian economies, to Malthus, Darwin's evolution, Marx's dialectical materialism, into Freud, who understood this very well, the damaging nature of all of these metaphors, and then finally into behaviorism. I think that's the modern worldview, and it's mechanistic, materialistic, reductivistic, and deterministic, to put it in a nutshell. And it decorates the back end of the Royal Academy. So it's interesting that in the 19th century, they really understood this apostolic succession and understood it as locating ourselves in cultural space and time. And it is not a far-fetched metaphor to see this culminating in modern architecture, in the heroic period of modern architecture, the period of black and white architecture, when the functionalist, mechanistic houses for living in was at least a one-liner, a slogan, which Corbusier later regretted, but which he nevertheless said. And this picture of the two heroes of the heroic period, Mies van der Rohe and Le Corbusier, in their black and white costumes in 1927, even with Mies's spats on, and Corb's pipe type in black, and his bow tie type and his glasses type, bowler hat types, standardized types, that is to say. You can see the kind of standardized architecture that later became built all over America in the downtown, and not only America, but every major city. So mechanistic architecture of a reductivist, deterministic kind more or less triumphed in the modern economy. And it was based on a form of communication which Corbusier called purism in the 20s. And this drawing shows, quoting Cézanne, everything is spheres, cylinders, cones, and the perfect Platonic forms, shows how unbroken architecture is from Plato through classicism up through modernism. I mean, a point that Peter Eisenman makes in his recent polemic. There are the simple forms which déclenche, which release constant sensation. Rome, a drawing of Rome by Corbusier, shows the simple forms releasing their constant sensation. And déclenche, release, is a behaviorist notion. In other words, the notion that, that there is an underlying language of stimulus and response which which could communicate was one of the ideas of purism. And so cities such as Glasgow decanted their centers to the outskirts, and they built machines for living in the suburbs, and then these houses or these machines for living in the center. Unfortunately, of course, it was that combined with a Smithian economy which led to the fact that it was not a city in the park, but the parking lot in the city, which ultimately became the unfortunate mixture of modern architectural positive intentions and the economy. Well, that is what I would say is the dominant modernism, but there is a recessive modernism, and it's the recessive modernism of Tatlin on the left or the early Bauhaus on the right, which I'll come back to later, which forms a different kind of interpretation of what I've said so far. And Einstein's tower, which according to Einsteinian physics was meant to measure, it wasn't finished in time, it was meant to measure the bending of space and time by matter. And here you can see a version of that. Wonderful warped Saturn and its rings, warped by that black body in the center. May be or may not be. We don't actually know how much of the curves in this building are a metaphor for the Einsteinian worldview. But it was the Einstein Tower, and Mendelsohn did at least discuss some of these things with the Einsteinian physicists he met. So this is what I would call the recessive tradition. In other words, it was this cosmic tradition of modernism which didn't triumph when the mechanistic one really became dominant in the 50s and 60s. A final fall, and this one is very much a postmodern one, is a recent discovery in the 80s that not only are things as bad as we thought from the previous 5 falls, but it turns out that there have been 6 mass extinctions, the greatest one in the Permian-Triassic period, when something like 92% of all species were killed, perhaps by an asteroid hit, cometary disaster, or volcanic eruptions. In any case, 65 million years ago was the last great mass extinction, the end of the dinosaurs and some other species, and of course the fanning out of some, including mammals and ourselves, after the dinosaurs went extinct. So it's information like this which has put a certain Darwinian worldview into doubt, and a recent book is called Bad Genes or Bad Luck. In other words, it's not maybe a question of survival of the fittest or the survival of the best genes or the selfish genes, as another bad metaphor has it, but just being lucky where the species happen to exist when the planet is hit. That's a debate today. So all of those discoveries, and most of them here are scientific, are interpreted discoveries, aren't they? They're not only so-called facts of the universe and nature, but they're seen through certain underlying metaphors. And they are metaphors which alienate us from nature. And these interpretations extend into sociology and the history of recent time. So 2 books of the 80s, Modernity and the Holocaust by Zygmunt Bauman, shows some very disturbing underlying thought patterns that come out of instrumental rationality that lead to the concentration camps. And Jeffrey Herf on the left, sociologist and historian at Cambridge, writes about reactionary modernism. In other words, Hitler's modernism as a reactionary form of modernism under the Third Reich. So if you say Christianity was a meta-narrative that lasted more or less up to the 16th and 17th century, and modernism is a meta-narrative that lasts more or less from the 17th century into the present time, then modernity itself as a meta-narrative has been thrown into doubt. As well, Lyotard has said, you know, Auschwitz, Lyotard said, ushers in postmodernity. Bauman says postmodernity is understanding modernity after the Holocaust. As we know, however, there are a series of other reactions in the present to this situation. And in America, for instance, sociologists have recently shown that there are 2,000 different religions, distinct groups, and there are more forms of Buddhism than there are in the East. In other words, in our supermarket of cults, there isn't just scientific narratives, but there are a kind of fragmenting of previous ones. And show example here, going back to 1800 after the French Revolution, the goddess of reason on the high altar of La Notre Dame, to show you when France was turned into a republic of reason for 10 or 15 years, they transformed the Christian metaphors and narratives into ones that were based on reason, but it was a reason, for instance, one of the reasons it failed was that it was a 10-day work week, and that was an unreasonable amount of time to work, so people didn't like that. Well, what is the situation today, and why is redesigning the universe necessary? All of this is a background to what I want to say in a positive level. First of all, the description that science brings us is shown in these two slides, a book of science or Newsweek on a popular or professional level. You see that scientists, when they talk about it, always refer to the origin as a Big Bang. And they say that the universe is going to end in either a big crunch, or if it's open, it'll end in a heat death. If you think of the word Big Bang as a metaphor, as an explanation, you see at once why I've called this an adolescent metaphor. It was not big, it was not a bang, no one heard it. And it's profoundly not an explosion. In other words, it was an expansion, inflation from the size of a quark to the size of a grapefruit in a trillionth of a second, faster than the speed of light. The universe expanded. An extraordinary moment, which was named Big Bang in a negative, as a negative epithet by Fred Hoyle, who hated the idea, and then it was taken up, and it's now used universally as a description of how things are. When scientists talk about what is most of the universe made up of, they say the dark gray matter is either machos or wimps. In other words, if it started in a Big Bang, then what continues today, 90% of it is either a wimpish man or a macho man. In other words, another Pentagon-like metaphor. I've mentioned that Richard Dawkins, who is the scientist that Bill Gates funded to be in charge of the public understanding of science in Britain, refers to the deep truth of biology as made up of selfish genes, and the whole system is run by a blind watchmaker. So one could take these metaphors, and there are countless metaphors that are made today, to show that scientists themselves, while they may tell us important things, interpret it in ways which are adolescent. Now, that is, to once again reiterate, negative on a public level, and architecture is, after all, a public art form, but it does mean that there are other discourses possible. And here is one, Cosmogenesis, by a Harvard cosmologist, who uses a term that has a history of about 50 or 60 years. And the point of this metaphor is that it strikes at the one of cosmos. In other words, we don't live in a cosmos, we live in a cosmogenesis. And that, of course, is to take the Genesis story of the Christians and to combine it with a static cosmos. Einstein believed in a static cosmos. But we now know the profound thing is that the universe is unfolding. It's dynamic. It's a single unfolding creative event. And I show on the left here a slime mold in one of its stages is this self-organizing form of life that can break apart into individuals and then coagulate together to form a super organism. So we're beginning to see different kinds of metaphors come out of science and come to the fore. The famous chaotic attractor of Lorentz, known as the butterfly attractor, shows one of these sciences of complexity shows this self-similar structure where the folding in of a cosmogenic process creates something that's always like itself but never exactly like itself. In other words, if the Mies van der Rohe architecture is self-same, then as we see, chaotic attractors underline not only the weather, but the heart, the brain, and maybe the embryo as it develops. We're beginning to see that there is a kind of form underlying the universe, but it's not a Platonic form. It's a form of self-similarity. It's a fractal form. And one of the biggest examples of that is the red spot of Jupiter, which is, we know from observations in the 17th century, has been around for 300 years. That is, some fluid, which is larger than the Earth, has self-organized in the most extraordinary way to keep a kind of coherence in an otherwise turbulent fluid of chaotic fluid. So one of the deep new metaphors that Ilya Prigogine is put forward, and he's the Nobel Prize winner of 1977 in chemistry and other fields, is order out of chaos, or really organization out of chaos. In other words, the notion that chaos and order are intimately connected, and the universe really is a form of self-organization within chaos. Chaos then is generative, and Genesis is a deep metaphor. And so the notion is then the universe is not something that's made by a male architect and something that's distant from us, but something that is all the time generating. And so you get a different view of matter. If, for Newton, matter was hard, impenetrable, and stable, and inert and dead, that's how he defined it. He said massy, hard, impenetrable particles, atoms, like anything that's hard, a little kind of billiard balls or little pieces of dust that you couldn't break up. Then we're beginning to see matter as not hard, impenetrable, dead, and lifeless, inert, but something much more self-organizing. And so from this book, you see Paul Davies' nature has, quote, free will, when, as Prigogine said, when you push a system far from equilibrium, it reaches a critical point and jumps to a higher or lower level, far from equilibrium. And I'll be showing that in a second in a video. In any case, and then a sequence of evolution from Hubble, which has only been confirmed in about a year and a half ago, was how solar systems form, planetary systems form from gravity pulling in swirling dust clouds until something is ignited at the center, it becomes a star. The star spins, but then the spinning stops, and when the spinning stops, the planets form other self-organizing systems, which then, as it were, vacuum up the comets and debris, and then planets are formed. So this planetary evolutionary system is a self-organizing order which comes out of chaos, and of course it has a sequence. In other words, it's going through stages, and there's no natural selection. So you find here evolution without war of nature. You find even a kind of teleology. So you begin to see that contemporary sciences form a different way of perceiving the universe. And art forms, of course, have depicted that in the past. Taoist art forms, particularly the Chinese Taoism and Chinese garden art and Chinese rocks, which I show you here, are meant to illustrate a process of cosmogenesis, of billowing cloud-like formation, which is never the same, but is always self-similar. So there is, I would argue, a postmodern science of complexity, which has now more or less reached a consensus among scientists, although it still doesn't enjoy a complete consensus. In other words, modernist Darwinian scientists like Dawkins and Hawking are still the major professors and still control the universities. But everybody who's under 40, more or less, recognizes that the new sciences of complexity at least are contesting the place of these linear sciences. So I think the big picture on the level of science is very positive. I won't go into this in any, well, I won't discuss it anymore, but to say that I do think there's a new paradigm in the sciences. And when there's a new paradigm in the sciences, then there will be a new paradigm in architecture, because at the end of the day, architecture as a cultural formation will be responsive to what we know the universe to be. And if we now know the universe to be different from what we thought it before, then architecture would change. So then it becomes very much a question of choice. And if we could have the video now for a second, and I'll show a quick view of what at least one scientist thinks is a description of self-organizing criticality. This is Stuart Kaufman.
It's pointed to when one says anti-chaos.
In the same way that a network of light bulbs can represent certain aspects of the behavior of the human genome, more dynamic complex systems can be modeled and studied by watching piles of sand form.
The sand pile model is a model of a large dynamical system which consists of many parts. Suppose you build the sand pile by dropping grains of sand one at a time on your desk. In the beginning, the pile will be flat and it will be near equilibrium. All the sand grains of sand will be lying very low and they won't see each other, they won't interact with each other. As you keep adding particles to the system, the heap will become steeper and steeper, and you will start getting small avalanches in the system. That means that the individual parts of the system start interacting with each other. And eventually, the avalanches will become bigger and bigger and bigger until you reach a critical slope where the system will not grow any further. And at that state, you have avalanches of all sizes. That means that the system interacts globally. What happens at one part of the heap can eventually affect what happens at any other part of the heap. We don't have separate grains of sand anymore. We don't have many distinct systems. We have only one pile of sand that form one big dynamical system.
Such systems are all around us. The extremes of the weather, the extinction of species, wild fluctuations of currency markets, and many other phenomena.
Down to 30, Jeremy!
Think of earthquakes as being generated by pushing tectonic plates into each other. In the beginning, the system is at equilibrium, just as the sand pile is in equilibrium in the flat state. But eventually, as the tectonic plates keeps squeezing into each other, you get into a state that is further and further and further out of equilibrium. And again, the earthquakes then will become bigger and bigger and bigger because the forces will become bigger and bigger and bigger. And the law for the sand slides in the sand slide models is exactly equivalent to what is called the Gutenberg-Richter law for earthquakes. Namely, that every time you have, say, one earthquake of size 6, you have 10 earthquakes of size 5, and 100 earthquakes of size 4, and so on. And the sand pile model exhibits precisely this feature. So that gives an understanding of why we have this very peculiar law for earthquakes. Actually, what it means is that the crust of the earth on which we are walking is at what we call a critical state. It's precisely as this sand pile when it's at this state where it can grow no further. So this is completely different from the usual picture that people have of what's going on around us, namely that we think of things as being in some kind of equilibrium, but nothing could be further from the truth.
Right, nothing could be further from the truth. Well, a slight exaggeration. We don't have earthquakes in London every day. But the notion is that the Earth and the universe is always self-organizing towards this edge between order and chaos. A slogan of the science is more is different. If you think of nature in this way, then, as self-organizing, as dynamic, as generative, you can see the switch from the metaphor of making something to generating it, more like a woman generates a child inside her, or things are grown rather than built. Of course, for architects, that's problematic because 99% of what we see around us today is built. It's a kind of second nature. It's not generated. And it's built according to legal specification. Anyway, be that as it may, what I think is happening is that our view of matter as dead is changed to something else. And so I propose changing the word matter along this in this manner of the sand pile to something like mutter, taking the phrase from the German of mother, because matter is now seen to reach a point where instead of it being inert, as it was for Newton, when it's pushed far from equilibrium, it can see each other. That's the metaphor you heard Per Bach use, and in fact, quite independently, Prigogine uses that same metaphor. In other words, all of a sudden, the individual grains of sand act in a holistic manner, act in a nonlinear manner, act in a dynamic manner. And that change from matter to mutter, it strikes me, is one of the first metaphors that we can see in this new architecture. In Peter Eisenman's work, as analyzed by Sanford Quinter, for instance, this building in Cincinnati recently finished, School of Architecture and Art and Design and Planning, which is added onto an old zigzag chevron building here. Eisenman adds on this linear part here and this very deep central plan part there, and then indicates exactly which, through blue and green and pink and other colors, which generative system the parts of the building are created by. The building was generated by a computer partly, so it wasn't in the classical sense designed. Eisenman didn't fully understand the building, never did, nor did the people who built it fully understand it. They didn't control it, sort of always somewhat out of control. And as Quinter shows, it represents in all sorts of ways the notion of geological tectonic plates pushing against each other, crushing each other, slamming up against each other. The earthquake metaphor is there. You can see how the two of the generative forms, this chevron here, has an attractor basin here. So it's a strange attractor which oscillates both in the zigzags and in the segmental worm-like offices and design studios. As you look at it, then it becomes a big metaphor of these tectonic plates, and in its both on the large exterior scale and on the very small scale, even in the linoleum here, and this, by the way, is a very cheap plastic building, you can see the lines and the colors taking up this metaphor. The metaphor, to a certain extent, humanizes the building, although Eisenman talks about it being an inhuman building in the sense that it's not designed from any perspective, not designed from any particular point of view. It's very human because of the breaking up of this large mass into chunks of space and color, which are always slightly tilted with respect to each other, or sheared, or crashing into each other. As you see, this is the old building here, and this is the new addition there, in such a way that none of the pieces is gigantic or too repetitive. In other words, it has a human scale. Secondly, it has a very interesting relationship between the stairway and this major piazza space. The students, the 3,000 or 4,000 students, stream through both spaces every day, and they have their juries in this sort of Spanish Steps area, so that it becomes a passage space, which is a room of communication and a room of interaction. So a building which is made out of fluorescent tubes, linoleum, and the cheapest form of sprayed concrete is then taking metaphors of the earth and strange attractors to create a landform building. And landform buildings relate to this notion, another one of the sciences of complexity, which Mandelbrot has revealed since the 70s, is what he calls the fractal geometry of nature. And he's shown these chaotic equations can generate a kind of order and self-similarity, which, of course, romantic painters like Friedrich have used as a background to some of their paintings. And the fractal is been known about in 1920 architecture, and in today's stealth aircraft, you could say it's a fractal aircraft. And there are fractal buildings being constructed. This is one in Berlin by the Israeli architect Zvi Hecker. And it's taking the sunflower form, rotating it in a counterclockwise way, breaking it up into 7, I think, different fractal segments, and spinning it around the center and entrance. So there is this as an emergent metaphor, partly based, of course, as the 1920 architecture was, on notions of crystalline architecture. I myself have used this to generate, in this room, a desk in an octagon, which is an octagonal desk, for 4 architects to work simultaneously on these on these non-flat surfaces, which pivot with fractal-like self-similar drawers below. And these relate to a fractal form, directly relate to the fractal form above your head. Penrose, Roger Penrose, discovered / invented a strange fractal in the late 70s, something later called the Penrose tile. He wanted to see if he could get a repeat pattern that, based on 2 exactly similar or same tiles, that would generate a form that never repeated. And so he discovered that, and then by 1984 they discovered that nature makes use of these non-repeating organic, as it were, forms, and they're called quasi-crystals. The quasi-crystal has the amazing property that although the units do repeat exactly, there is no overall repetition ever. And this, of course, forms a really interesting philosophical idea and potential urban approach. If you squint, you can begin to see that there is a pattern. This is a design I made for a rug. And in order to make a Penrose pattern economically, of course, you have to repeat. Otherwise, you'd have to make this by hand. So if you squint, you can see a pattern of repetition emerge. But the idea behind the Penrose pattern is that it doesn't ever repeat. It's holistic but complex. And it's based, as you can see, on a they form these kind of footballs that I've colored, one green and one blue here. And these footballs overlap. And they're based on 2 rhomboids, a fat rhomboid here and a thin rhomboid there, 2 kites. Interestingly, I think about a year ago, I think the Kleenex company started to produce this pattern for toilet paper. And I understand that Penrose is suing them for a great deal of money. Interestingly, as if you could own a quasi-crystal. I don't know how the lawsuit is going, but I hope he doesn't sue me. I'm only making one rug. There is a building that's opened recently in Melbourne, which uses this same pattern in a different way on the outside and the inside. And it's interesting, I feel this is really the speculation, could you have a new urban order? Think of the past urban order here. You have a classical building on the left, a high classical on the left, and a low classical on the right. The building between, by the way, was an old 19th century Hibernian hall, an Irish hall, hence the green, and then a women's institute and feminist hall in the 1920s, hence the purple. Those are the traditional colors of the feminist movement, and the green Irish. So hence the two colors go throughout this building. But the pattern is interesting to think about. The pattern on the left shows the urban order that makes the classicist order more rich than the modern order, at least than the Misesian order. The base, the rusticated base, the paired columns, the pediments, the window order, the grand order, and then the attic order, and then at the top, a finish. All of that proportioned in different ways according to certain rules. And a true urban order, which of course has disciplined Western cities for more than 2,000 years. Well, if this idea is right of Penrose, and if you speculate a little bit, then you can see that we could have a richer kind of order if we follow the Penrose tiling pattern, because like things that grow, like the quasi-crystals, we could have a coherence. We could have an order, that is the two tiles, and it would forever generate new holes. So it would be much closer to, say, the human heart, the human brain, the way the embryo grows, and other strange attractors, and more interesting to the mind and more interesting to the eye than the classical or the modern order. So I think this building really is a speculation along those lines, even if it's a little bit jumped up and over the top in its color and in its lead finishing. It's lead finished as if it were a kind of ruckly skin. And here you can see a super graphic order going over the Penrose order. This is a window. This window, by the way, is meant to relate to the heroic order of the classical, which is right off here. So it's a giant order in the Penrose manner. You come through the ground floor up into the foyer here and then enter into the large auditorium. As I say, it's a converted building, and for that reason, the thinking is more in the ornament and decoration than it is in the section, but there is sectional thinking with these fractals as well. You can see there, or in the main auditorium, you can see looking down at the stage here, or looking back at the first floor. And the old building, you can see the old building here. So it's a collage then between this new fractal Penrose order and the classical, and very interesting interrelationship, where the lighting behind these five-sided pentagons. It's interesting how the architects have used that super order of the pentagon to lay over the Penrose order. So it's the interaction of the two there, which is rather interesting. It's also interesting the way that they've used the acoustic tiles, which is a tiling pattern too, as a literal transformation of the Penrose. Well, there's another set of metaphors which are emerging today in this nonlinear architecture, if one calls it that. Landform buildings, many landform buildings, and I think at the AA, of course, those are well known because of FOA, who taught here and occasionally teach here. I won't say any more about that. I'll just show my own work in landform architecture, which is this garden I'm designing, and I have designed with my late wife, Maggie Keswick. It's a garden which is partly based on the notion of a landscape of waves, and particularly the metaphor of the soliton wave and the wave of the electron and the wave forms of the atom. I've worked on it with various scientists and other designers to try to work out these different kinds of metaphors to think about design. So, taking the soliton wave is a very interesting wave. You may know about it. It's like a tidal wave or a tidal bore, or a tsunami, as it's called. That is, it's a coherent wave of energy which keeps a memory of its past into the future. Apparently, we have solitons in our body, maybe in our brain. Plasma physics shows soliton action. And they've discovered when they were seen in the 19th century, when they were seen to be waves that didn't dissipate, in other words, they carry on. Someone followed a soliton wave through a canal for 8 or 9 miles, followed it on horseback, and it never stopped. So it's a coherent energy wave packet, and it has these extraordinary properties of being able to go through each other, as indeed, just as atomic waves can tunnel through walls. Now, those waves are really one of the things that recent science has discovered us, which is waiting, I think, for a new poetry, a new kind of architecture. And so this garden landscape of waves is meant to look at that metaphor, or series of metaphors. And in these series of gates, maybe 10 or 15 of these gates, I've shown them as negative voids traveling through twists in metal to focus on the latches or the hinges, taking the energy wave from the hinge to the latch. You can see how a soliton can be represented by a hump or a twist, and how only an anti-twist can get rid of the trapped energy of the soliton. Well, you can translate these metaphors quite directly into twists in metal. And so it's interesting to think of this as positive and negative energy waves that you're seeing on your retina. An idea that goes through this garden is that of positive, negative. And in this particular gate, called the reversal gate, it's a gate, of course, where passage is reversed all the time, but and where the soliton wave is reversed. But it also shows another strange truth, or it represents a strange truth that scientists are showing us today. They say the history of the 15 billion year history of the universe, if it's 15 billion years, is one of symmetry breaking. And so symmetry breaking is when you push things far from equilibrium, they suddenly bifurcate. They jump to a new level of organization, as I say, either up or down. And so the symmetry break is a new form of organization. And it's interesting that the symmetry can exist in words. So if you look at this words, you find positive on negative and negative on positive. In other words, reversal of the surface of the stone here. And if you stand on your head or you look upside down, you can see that the words also work in reversal. In other words, the language sometimes imitates these symmetries and these symmetry breaks. If you search very hard for the right set of letters and design them in the right way, you can get letters that you can read backwards. Well, one of the most extraordinary discoveries of 20th century quantum physics is that waves of energy, electrons, in fact all the atomic particles in a sense have a wave dimension, and this spreads out until it's viewed, and then it turns into a particle, or there's a collapse of the wave function. I won't take you into quantum reality, but you know that, I'm sure you all know the story that the wave acts, all atomic particles, and there are many, many different kinds from the atom on down, behave like bullets from a gun and also waves from water, but but they behave like both. And when you're measuring them or not measuring them, depending on what situation you set up, you can learn more about either its wave aspect or its particle aspect, but you can never learn about both together. In other words, you always sacrifice one for the other to a degree. So it's this quantum weirdness which extends from the quantum realm right up to the galactic realm. It's just that everything bigger than an atom, the wave function becomes too small to measure, but it's still there. So we have a wave function. You and I have wave functions. This building has a wave function. And quantum weirdness then extends into the whole universe. So it becomes, I think, an important area for representation. And one of the ways one could represent it is through interference patterns of interacting elements, as you see on the right. Or on the left here, the waves are folding in movement to the water here, or to the on the top to the landscape. It's folding it into homogeneity and then unfolding it on the other side. And we've tried to do that in this part of the landscape, folding in, folding out, and taking a series of self-similar shapes throughout the landscape, so that the same form is transformed wherever you look. So it's never self-same, but always self-similar. Well, if that is a set of new metaphors, then another set is coming from the work of Gary. And he's more intuitive in his use of the new sciences. He is interested in folding theory, but he works on a much more intuitive level. And the Bilbao Museum, which is now reaching completion, the Guggenheim Museum in Bilbao, I think is a very interesting set of metaphors. Metaphors of growth and then metaphors of the city, intermixed. You can see it on one level as a giant, hardy urban plant, rather like Gaia, the notion of the Earth as a robust system. You can see this as a riotous window box, or even some kind of weed, urban weed that's growing on top of these rectilinear shapes. These more or less box-like masonry shapes. And like a hardy urban plant, it's a riotous weed that won't stop growing, even if it's polluted, and even if you kill it and you don't water it, it still comes back as Gaia seems to come back. So I see in his work this, on an intuitive level, a very strong attempt to re-metaphorize architecture in terms of self-similarity. There are 26 petals, for instance, you can see here, that are really bursting out into the landscape, the mountains in the background, and the cityscape in the foreground. This photograph is taken between these very tight rectilinear buildings. And what's extraordinary in this urban landscape is the way these titanium shapes, the steel shapes, really burst out. In other words, the bursting is not only in the shape, but in the color. So the building has an extraordinary presence, urban presence, which I think is greater than any building I can think of, except for Chartres. In other words, this, in a sense, the metaphor of the museum as cathedral is very apparent on an urban level. As you look down on this building from the surrounding mountains, it really glows in a dark background, as if it had been airbrushed to stand out and reflect the sun. I think perhaps some days it's going to create car accidents, as literally the sun glistens off these shapes, and people driving along the superhighway to the right there are suddenly blinded and drive off the road. But it's a very impressive urban building. And you can see that it's a building like Eisenman's, to a certain extent generated, grown in a computer. This is the computer rendition of the structural steel. And through that generative system, which is based on a French program worked out for the Mirage fighter, Gary has managed to cut the cost somewhat by a half. I've been talking to the people who are actually getting this building built, and I said, how much more expensive is the building because it has curves? If you built it all with squares, how much would it be less? And he said it would be something like 10 to 15% cheaper. So it's interesting that then through computer design, and really through computer production, you can come within 10 to 15% with these self-similar curved buildings to the rectilinear, as it were, modern buildings. And that's very interesting. On the other hand, when asked why is the titanium rectangle always repeated again and again and again, it is the self-same rectangle everywhere. And so I said, shouldn't, or couldn't Gary have designed 4 different tiles or 4 different shingles and varied them as his fish scales vary around the building? And the man who's building it said, no, that would have been economically impossible. So it's interesting that the paradigm has reached the stage where you can do the new architecture and the new science in volume and elevation and plan, but you can't yet do it in detail because each one of these titanium sheets has to be pre-formed at the factory by computer, pre-bent, and the clips all have to be pre-set. So everything, because the process is still so rigid, you can't do what you can do, in a shingle building. We haven't reached that stage yet. But I think it is not too far in the future. Gary himself not only works on a computer, but in fact he doesn't like a computer very much, but he works with a computer and he works with endless models. And I think that is why he's, in a sense, a more complete architect than Eisenman and the others, because he resolves his buildings in terms of the eye, the walk-through, the space, the light, and the function in a way which the other architects maybe aren't so obsessively involved with. Gary really models his buildings endlessly. So for me, Gary really carries out this paradigm, and this building more or less represents it more than any other one. But there are many other buildings being constructed in the paradigm. And so I think we have a new architecture based on the new science. And the next question is then, what is its relation to the new cosmology? So, and look, just coming back to this question of the universe as a single creative unfolding event, which is now, since Stephen Hawking's writing, since many scientists' work in the last 20 years has become popular. We have now popular science. We have what Brockman, who's the agent for these scientists, calls the third culture. We have, in a sense, the beginning of a relationship between a popular culture and a creative group of scientists, so that you can get, say in 1992, you can get on the front page of The Independent this full frontal view of that says how the universe began. And imagine the change, the shift in culture and cosmology when you compare it to what happened in 1919 when Einstein's theory of relativity was proved, and it was announced in the Times on page 19. It was tucked away on page 19. It said, "New theory of universe proved," little runner. So from page 19 to the front page, you have an indication of how cosmology has, in a sense, become public. And therefore, the story of the universe, however crudely depicted here, has, on a certain level, become our narrative. So the question is, then how does one represent it? Does one still have recourse to the Big Bang, which is still the overriding metaphor that scientists fall into, this adolescent metaphor? Well, my argument is that you can take this story as narrativized both by theologians, scientists, historians, biologists, and others, and then take out what you consider the salient points and see it as a series of jumps in organization from maybe the most important, which was the inflationary jump at the very beginning here, which resolved the laws so that, for instance, the four forces which hold everything together here, gravity, the strong and weak force, and electromagnetism, these four forces hold together a series of jumps in organization. Something like 30 jumps, if you divide the universe story into 30, you ask yourself, or you ask scientists, what are the 30 most important things that have happened? You then can break it down into a narrative, like the Genesis story, which has a certain significance. Of course, and my point here is there is choice. You can represent that, as I've done, not as an explosion, but as a vase or a trumpet or a cornucopia, or you can take the same information and see it as an unfolding system from a point, although, as you probably know, there is no point in the universe. I mean, all points on the universe are, in a sense, the center of the universe. This is one of the ironies in my metaphors of the fall. You know, as Freud said, we found ourselves on the edge of a galaxy, a suburban planet. Well, it turns out that every point in the universe is the center of the universe as it expands. So that, no longer being in the center, there is kind of an axis mundi, or axis of the universe, in which all are part of the center, because it is a single creative unfolding event, because it is still part of that unitary act. And this one represents the jumps in terms of vibrations in steel here, ending over there with the origin of consciousness. Or that same set of jumps can be reduced further to 4 from the code, the underlying cosmic code, to jump from a selection from the cosmic code into the era of energy, jump into the era of matter, into the era of life, and into the era of consciousness, which reflects back through language on the codes. And in a symmetry break terrace, you see at an early stage here, you can see the origin of the energy era, then matter bending space and time. You see it's straight here, and then matter bending space and time, the era of matter, then life, and then consciousness growing. This hedge hasn't yet grown, but it will now grow up to 15 feet and then curve around. So the point I'm making here in these drawings and designs is that taking the facts of science, as it were, but subtracting the interpretations and redesigning the metaphors, one can redesign the universe. In other words, it's taking a proactive attitude towards the different discourses of religion and science, looking at the way they criticize each other, and forming a third culture out of what is understood. And I think that really is the role of architecture today. Of course, it's a role which has to transcend architecture, and it's really a role of all of culture. Because if science and religion, to a certain extent, have failed us, then this is an opening opportunity. And it strikes me that what I call the marginalized or recessive tradition of modernism, that is the early Bauhaus, as represented here by Schlemmer and his dancing troupe, or Itten and his creative group of early designers at the Bauhaus. There was a tradition of architecture and art and design which was very much involved with this cosmogenic design, which was very much involved with science. Thank you.
Questions. Joel, maybe I can get the microphone from you.
Yeah.
Can I start the first question by going back to the beginning? I guess every time I ask it. I don't remember all of what you said at the start, but it sounded as if you chose to take the Western scientific point of view as a starting point. And having done so, you then started talking about the nature of the universe almost as if it was established fact, rather than based on certain premises. If you took a much more Eastern one, you would start with consciousness. In other words, consciousness would be the basis of looking at science rather than the other way around. And you get a totally different view. I mean, your whole idea of the universe would be totally different. And I wonder, in that context, what became of the jump from positivism to idealism? What became from the jump from recognizing that there is no neutral objectivity? Everything is subject to our own consciousness. Everything is a product of our own consciousness. And I feel it's an important question because where you talk about events happening, such as in these latest buildings where forms can recover from pollution, etc. The other thing I find very much missing from the whole development is any sense of responsibility, almost as if we can opt out from the consequences of actions on a, on a planetary level, which could very easily destroy our civilization. And all of what we're talking about tonight may just not exist. I mean, if we don't do something about global warming, if we don't do something about pollution, all our preoccupations with fractals or anything else, I mean, they just go out of the window. So I'm worried that the by taking taking your scientist as your guru, basically, rather than your religious guru, and I don't believe religion has failed in that sense at all, I think it leads to a very profound and dangerous irresponsibility.
Right, thank you. Well, I didn't go into the ecological problems in my talk, that's quite true, but in the book I do have a whole section on precisely that crisis. And I do agree that it is a crisis. In fact, I would have, if I had had longer to talk, would have gotten into that in the sixth mass extinction. Actually, when I wrote the book, I wrote about it, and the book called The Sixth Mass Extinction hadn't been published. So I'm very conscious that 10% of the species or more have probably been already destroyed, and we are in a great crisis. I accept the second part of what you said as true. And I think something has to be done about it, but I'm deeply of the opinion that architects are not going to, A, be able to do too much, and B, I haven't been elected to do too much. In other words, it's basically a socio-cultural, economic, political problem, which has to be solved more at that level than, even though 50% of the pollution may be caused by architecture indirectly, as you know, architects only control at best 1% of world building, maybe influence another 5%. So architects are not in a position politically to do much more than complain and persuade people to care about ecology and design, therefore, exciting ecological buildings. But they can't, as a profession, really do too much, I don't believe. Nevertheless, I agree with you, something must be done. So as a citizen, one must act. That's my answer to the second part of your question. The first part, I don't agree with you. I don't think that religion or consciousness can step outside the narrative of the universe. The universe is primary, the Earth is secondary. The Earth comes after the universe. We thought maybe 3 months ago there was a discovery that scientists said there are stars that are older than the universe, but now we know, thankfully, that the universe is older than those stars. So the Earth isn't, I'm not a geocentric person, and I don't think, human animals come first. The universe is first. The universe is the measure of all things. And the science is the longest single unbroken meditation on the universe. I mean, religions are not usually unbroken. If you look at the history of religions, Galileo is in and out, Darwin is in and out, at least as far as the Vatican is concerned. And Hinduism doesn't deal with either Galileo or Darwin, and nor does Confucianism, nor does Taoism, nor do the other major religions. First of all, so I don't think religion is, it used to, I grant you that religions used to claim to give you a worldview, but now religions are in a passive relationship to science. We all are. I mean, in fact, science, but of course, to talk about science as if it were one thing is probably a mistake, because what we have are many paradigms of science moving forward. And yet, of course, there is a consensus. There is still modernist science, right? It is no joke that Dawkins is the scientist in charge of public understanding of science in Britain and got his money from Bill Gates. That's no surprise. Nor that The Blind Watchmaker and The Selfish Gene are bestsellers. That's no surprise either. It's no surprise that Stephen Hawking and his very adolescent view of the universe is in the driver's seat. There's no surprise in a Smithian economy, in other words, Adam Smith, that we value, the old materialism more, that Madonna sings, "I'm a materialist girl." The materialist paradigm still is in charge. I think the old modernism of Corbusier and Mies, even though, they're long dead, is still 80% of building around the world. And the kind of building I'm talking about, and the kind of science I'm talking about here, is yet to take over all the academies, unfortunately, but it will. I mean, that's a prediction.
Could I just interject so that I leave one comment and then so things move on? The level on which I'm taking it is so fundamental, goes way back beyond materialism, and that is that there is no universe outside ourselves. The universe does not exist outside ourselves. Item 1 is our consciousness. Item 2 is that there may be a world outside our consciousness. But our only fact is our consciousness.
Yep.
And therefore, you cannot start. As soon as you start with a material universe, you're assuming it's out there. Now, the Eastern philosophy is it's not out there. It's all in here.
Well, I understand what you're saying, and I think that that is a well-articulated statement of that philosophy. Of course, consciousness and culture and language create our reality. There's no science without a culture or language, and are internalizing that. That's true. So there's a certain irreducible cultural component, a consciousness component to reality. But to therefore say that that's primary, or all there is I think just simply wrong. The universe came before us, We may be conscious of it. We may create and construct it, socially construct it through our language and our perceptions. But it will be very happily go on without us. And I think that, that is a statement which is true. And your statement is a statement which is false. But we can discuss that later. Stephen Rose.
Just to take you back, Charles, to your jumps. Just to take you back to your jumps and your concept of self-organization. The jump which I think needs a little bit of unpicking is the jump between non-life and life, without taking the Cartesian position, the Eastern Cartesian position we've just heard. Because with life comes something which is different from the self-organization you've seen hitherto, and that is the involvement of information. And information doesn't appear, as I understand it, in the diagrams and the jumps that you've got there. So evolution in living organisms, natural selection in living organisms, and all the other processes that drive life forms forward is qualitatively different from self-organization, which is without the informational content within it, I suspect. And I'd be very interested in your comment on that.
Well, Stephen Rose is one of those scientists from whom I learn a great deal, as I have just done now. So I have trouble answering that. I think I agree with you, as far as I can make a comment about it, that that information is an important jump and distinction between living and non-living. I understand, though, that there's views of information which are inherent in the quantum world. So I'm reluctant to think there's an absolute distinction between non-living and living in that matter. in any case, for me, the new paradigm in science shows that both matter and living things have this self-organizing in common, and they're much more dynamic than we ever thought. Both of them. They're much more fast-changing. I mean, evolution is much more fast-changing than we thought. And the dynamism of geology and planets are much more fast-moving than Darwin thought, or than Lyell thought. I remember Lyell and Darwin thought that things were really gradual and slow, and didn't jump, more or less. So I think this is why the jumping paradigm, or the metaphor of jumping, I've seen as a fundamental challenge to that gradualistic paradigm. And I think that, well, Stephen Jay Gould, although I think in many ways he's a modernist, in other words, he's still a Darwinian, he has brought out more postmodern things than almost anyone else I can think of. And his notion of and Eldridge's notion of punctuated equilibrium is, I think, a more profound metaphor than gradualism. And I know this isn't answering your question, but it's sort of an extension of agreeing with you.
The first thing I'd kind of comment on really is really about the types of justifications which are used for certain forms of architecture. I mean, it seems to me one of the ironies of showing kind of the work of Eisenman and Gehry is that we might have been here kind of 10 or 15 years ago saying these, as it were, materialized or embodied the philosophical work of Jacques Derrida. So, I mean, you know, it's clear that there's a kind of real problem, kind of trying to tie architectural forms to kind of specific kind of forms of knowledge. That was the first point. The second thing is I wasn't, like at the heart of it, quite sure what the argument that you're making was, in the sense, if, granted for a moment, that there is some new paradigm of science, were you saying that, as it were, it would automatically, as a kind of naturalism, follow that architecture ought to kind of mimic the processes which are now kind of perceived to be occurring in nature? That would be sort of one element. Because secondly, when you actually show things, kind of architectural objects, which to you in some sense exemplify that, they don't look like the mimicry of a process. They look to me like a certain representation. I mean, quite often even a kind of symbolism of that process. I mean, it really didn't seem to me that the Australian Irish feminist theatre kind of like embodied a certain contemporary understanding of the process of nature. I mean, at most it was a sort of symbolic ornamentation. So there were
Okay,
kind of three
right.
points.
Right. Well, first of all, I do think that both Gehry and Eisenman have explicitly gone in beyond Derrida and deconstruction. I think that that's clear. And so has Daniel Libeskind, especially in this, in the V&A project, which I didn't show, but which I would include in the same paradigm. And they've gone beyond it in all sorts of ways. For one thing, in deconstruction, there is usually an oppositional system and a deconstructing of things. And what's so apparent in Gehry, Eisenman, and Liebeskind's buildings is that this is a new form of showing complexity, but within a folding or holistic paradigm. In other words, things are folded into each other. In other words, unity, integration, coming together. Remember Gehry's buildings in the 70s and 80s were juxtapositions, like the form of postmodernism that Jim Sterling more or less epitomized, of a conjunction of opposites, Lyotard's language games fighting each other. That has been, as it were, transcended or sublated. And instead of a difference being completely repressed, though, it's folded in according to folding theory, right? So that's the explicit position of Eisenman and the explicit position of folding theory of Greg Lynn. It's also explicitly said by Daniel Libeskind when he was attacked at the V&A by I can't remember the old writer for the Times, you know, and he said, this is a nihilist building by Jacques Derrida and so forth, and how can we have it as for V&A? You know, it was answered by Libeskind, among others, that it has nothing to do with deconstruction and nothing to do with nihilism, nothing to do with that paradigm. So I would say that, yes, if these buildings had been produced 15 years ago, that would be the case. They would have been deconstructionists. But these buildings are really different from that. They're all you know, fluid. They're all integrative. They're all moving in, you know, warping in, folding in. This is a different language. It's not deconstructivist anymore. So it is not me switching the meta language. It is the buildings. You know, we can argue about this later if you don't agree, but I talk to them. Let's have a three-way discussion on it, because they've told me. The second and third points, well, the third point, second point, can you go from an is to an ought? What I'm trying to say is the new sciences give you hints, maybe, of possible and maybe positive things. You know, so I take from matter to mutter. Paul Davies says the thing about matter today is it doesn't exist anymore. More or less, there isn't any matter. It's disappeared, because we know, you know, the atoms are highly, you know, energized moving systems. It isn't hard, massy, impenetrable, and stick around the way, you know, it's the interaction of the electrons which makes that noise, right? But that's matter is 99% empty space, and it's moving. Okay, so. So that's changed our paradigm. Now, we can't go from an is to an ought directly. I mean, what I'm arguing there is the four ways to take the same information. We have choice. The architect has choice. The choice is in, you know, what metaphor we apply to it. We are responsible for metaphors. We don't accept big bangs. We don't accept big crunches. We don't accept machos and wimps. We don't accept blind watchmakers. We don't accept selfish genes. The scientists may tell us that's what the case is, but they're wrong. They're telling us metaphors, and they're bloody adolescent. So if they can't do it right, they can still tell us, you know, the workings of these things, but it's up to more responsible, more cultured people than scientists to invent and redesign their metaphors, all right? So my thing is proactive in a very aggressive way. Excuse me for being aggressive. But, you know, I'm saying, no, it's not just taking what science says, but criticizing it and inventing something better. And the third point is, no, it's not just representation, it's presentation. I am interested in ornament. I'm interested in, you know, in an ornamental language. Yes, I think it's very important to be ornament, to be symbolic. Both are very important, but it's also very important to generate and to use processes that come out of the new sciences. I mean, I've just mentioned the computer, but I think there are other processes. So presentation as well as representation. Right.
Charles, can you, this word metaphor, you use probably more than any other word throughout your lecture.
Right.
Can you say why you feel that there is in fact this necessity for the metaphorical in architecture? That somehow seems to be an explicit assumption on your part, and it's not quite clear to me that this is in fact a necessary condition for contemporary architecture.
Well,
why about the metaphorical?
Because I have a little chapter in the book called The Responsibility for Metaphor, and I think that, you know, architects don't have much control over anything, but they do have a control over metaphor, or they can. I mean, this is an area of choice, like style. And if the thing about, if you look at the way scientists, for instance, accept metaphors just unconsciously, like the Big Bang, and then they never question them again, we get locked into metaphors. You know, we got locked into the Christian metaphor, the fall of man. We got locked into the mechanistic metaphor. In a sense, a worldview always ends up in a metaphor. And in redesigning the universe, I'm saying, well, we have this freedom, rather like an existentialist. I'm saying, you know, it's an underdetermined system, what we now know about the universe. And an area of freedom is to choose metaphors. You don't have an unlimited choice here. I mean, you can't, obviously, you have to respect the limits of what science and other discourses are telling you, what reality is. You can't invent it ex nihilo. You can't invent it in your consciousness. I mean, to go back to the first question, we really have to deal with these limits. But within the limits, you do have an area of choice. And that choice is metaphorical. And I think it's a responsibility. In other words, it's to try to get back to consciousness what, let us say, the architects of the 60s and 70s, like Foster and Rogers and so on, made into an unconscious system. In other words, style and metaphor were never discussed. You know, Sterling even felt reluctant to discuss them. He said it just lost him jobs. And so a whole area of choice was pushed under the carpet and discussed in private between consenting adults, as they say, which I think is a mistake. I mean, architecture is a public art form, and therefore we ought to be able to discuss it openly with our clients.
But you don't think that you end up with exactly the same kind of problem, which I think is something that Mark is referring to, that in terms of the work of Eisenman, for example, in terms of these metaphorical references, it ultimately becomes irrelevant, really, what the point of reference is, because it is working with an idea of architecture which always attempts to really show something which is happening in another discipline very directly in terms of issues of form. Maybe there are other ways of developing this metaphorical analogy which are not always to do with the visual associations of the project. For example, in terms of use, you could argue that many projects have within them the possibility, the actualization of certain conditions of complexity, whereas they might not in fact look complex. Why is it that in architecture we're always fascinated with the idea of the visual association? That seems to me the problem, in the sense that the work of Eisenman at that level is not very different from the semiological associations of this means that now 20 years ago it meant something else, now it means something else, but in fact it's the same work. In fact the work is no different. I mean, because its assumptions in terms of the role of architecture and its associations in terms of what it's supposed to communicate are fundamentally part of the same kind of discipline. Now, it might be that the narrative has changed, but in fact the work itself hasn't really changed.
Well, in a sense, you're objecting, I think, as one of the previous questioners was, Mark, about the representation per se. And Levi-Strauss makes the point. He says, you know, and Levi-Strauss very much into semiotics and, you know, signs. He says, you know, he takes a hammer and he goes, you know, bangs it on the table. He says, well, this hammer doesn't just mean, this hammer works, right? Is. Of course, and that's true, and that's true of architecture. And architecture is a verb, and it has a being apart from a meaning. And I wouldn't deny that. On the other hand, it always is mediated through a representational system. It's understood and turned into signs through a process of visual representation and other representational systems. So I would say there's a fatality to mean, a fatality to represent. And whereas maybe Eisenman and I, to a certain extent, and maybe that group in Melbourne, are a little bit literal in our representational systems. For instance, Eisenman's done a DNA building where you can tell the DNA. I don't mind that. I mean, I think after all, you know, this DNA is one of the great, interesting recent discoveries, and if you're doing it for scientists, and it is one of the universal languages, if not the universal language of life, which is what we think it is, I think it's that architecture should take its leading metaphors from what we find as ultimate truths. So I don't mind that. Now, if you mind that, then you can have an architecture of otherness, in which there is no representation. It just is an isness architecture. The problem with the isness architecture is that...
Isness is already a form of representation.
No, but it just, you know, in other words, an architecture which is below consciousness, let's say. An architecture which you don't even know is there. A kind of orthothonous architecture. Well, I mean, you know, let's say we're just asleep walking. You can imagine it, at least conceptually, all right? I would say that would, as Roland Barthes says, you know, it is immediately turned, though, in consciousness into a sign of itself. And then it gets a history and a style, just as an umbrella may be just a useful object, but as soon as you see an umbrella the second time, you say, a sign of rain. The same is true. That fatality of semiotics happens. So
But it just depends at what moment you introduce that representation. It's not that whatever you do will have representation. It just depends at what moment you decide whether you want to prioritize that representation so that the primary
concern is with the visuality of that representation, or whether you want to achieve some other things through the project, which will also ultimately be representations themselves, because there is no such thing as work that has no representation, that you're sleepwalking. The work of an architect like Alejandro de los Soto that we were just discussing is an architecture that has incredible representation, but its primary task is not metaphorically to represent something else, but to be, for example, something like a gymnasium, if he is making, and to find through the limits of certain conditions, what are the possibilities of construction through those limits. That's a very different criteria for making architecture than...
Well, I think you are, I mean, I agree with you. This is very important, the isness, the being of whatever it is. I mean, architecture brings into being its own existential language to a certain extent, and then that becomes semiotized. I think we agree on that, but yeah.
Brian, maybe that could be...
I wanted to ask, a few minutes ago you mentioned the awful possibility that some stars might be older than the universe, and then you said, but thankfully they found out that's not the case. Now, why should it be a matter for thanks or celebration or lamentation? I mean, from what criterion do you draw the principle of thanks?
Yeah. Well, I think it's a very good question, and I have no immediate answer. I mean, I like a pataphysics, the sciences of singular occurrences, so that you could have stars older than the universe. I like that as a kind of thought process. So I don't want to rule it out. However, I feel a sense of relief that the unity of science is, even if it's a false unity, is, in other words, that I can understand the coherence where the universe is older than the stars within it, because it's hard to imagine the stars before, although it's quite true that probably are other universes that can be considered like the stars, older than this universe. So, I think there's a certain kind of poetic truth in that, but for the reasons that make your question interesting, make me respond this way and laugh, I don't want, maybe we could take on this over a drink.
Well, it's just to do with where do you draw your criterion of that?
No, the criterion of integrated discussion. In other words, I don't think that you can have a science that lives with a contradiction like that for very long. If you did, science, I accept the Popper's argument, science would come to a halt. In other words, you can't resolve quantum and relativity theory today. They produce infinities. It's crazy. It's like precisely the one that you put. We know it's crazy, but we can't do anything about it, right? And if you're a good scientist, you can't sleep well trying to resolve this. So you're saying, well, let him sleep lightly. Don't let him bother about it. Well, I say that's the end of science. If you accept contradiction like that happily, with a smile on your face, then that's...
I'm not saying that you shouldn't be bothered about it as a scientist. I think you should be bothered. I mean, if there's an exception to your rule, you need to find out why. That's fine. The question is why give thanks about it as an architect.
Can we leave it at that? Because time is running out.
Yeah. I've actually got two
quick questions. Maybe
really one.
Yeah.
Okay.
I've actually want to follow up on that a little bit, but I've got 2 points. I mean, the first would be, if you're looking at architects, sure. All right. Well, I guess if you're looking at architects as sort of metaphor inventors for scientists, you would think, and I enjoy the lecture, so this is going to sound a little harsh, but you would think that you would get it right. I mean, with the quantum physics, the primary aspect of that is that you can't exclude a participant's interaction with an experiment. That's the problem with quantum physics for physicists. That was one aspect. With relativity theory, I mean, in the case of the special relativity, I mean, you mentioned, in the Big Bang theory that was sort of a bad metaphor, but that somehow things were going faster than light in the beginning of that. Well, it doesn't work with relativity. It's an impossible statement. So the metaphors built off of that aren't going to work either. So, it's just something, to
well, I mean,
through
this again, it's a long discussion, but the science that, and scientists I've been talking with about it, like Paul Davis and others who are into cosmology, and Lee Smolin recently. The thing is, if you get into inflation theory, which is, of course, not a complete consensus, only 80% of cosmologists accept inflation theory, right? And there's two kinds of inflation theory. But according to that theory, in other words, an 80% theory accepted, it's not a complete consensus. It's not like the, quote, Big Bang, which is 98% accepted, and maybe not true, but anyway.